Hello and welcome to Humanities 1900 Intro to Film for OCC, winter semester of 2020. This is lecture video number 3 on genre. I wanted to talk a little bit more about conventions and iconography because I feel like really the best way to understand what they are and the difference between the two is by just kind of listing examples. Now, normally in the classroom, I would write this chart up on the board. We would brainstorm a particular genre we wanted to talk about, and then I would write down people's ideas in the corresponding categories. Unfortunately, since we can't do that kind of back and forth interface, I'm going to have to do it myself. But I figured that we would start with a genre that most of us are probably going to be familiar with. Now, even if you don't like this genre or you don't watch films in this genre, you're probably at least familiar with what it looks like. So if I showed you like a trailer, for example, you'd probably be able to say like, okay, yeah, that looks like a horror film. So what I wanted to do is kind of think a little bit about what the conventions and iconography of horror film look like and kind of jot down some ideas here on this chart. Now, conventions, like I mentioned in my last lecture video, are the things, the kind of unwritten rules that create a family resemblance between different films, where you can say that type of character, that actor or actress, that setting, that narrative structure, that plot device, all of those things to me say romantic comedy, horror film, Western, science fiction, right? Conventions, unwritten rules. Iconography is specifically the visual indicators that tell us that this film is a horror film or this film is a romantic comedy. The things that you see, right, that point to you that a film is a particular type of film. So if we're thinking about horror films, now I know that that's a very broad genre, right? You can break it down into lots and lots of different subgenres, right? Haunting films, possession films, exorcism films, zombie comedies, horror comedies, all sorts of different things, right? Slashers, and even within slashers, you get subgenres within that, right? So conventions across horror might be pretty broad, but I want you to start kind of thinking a little bit about what you would see in a horror film that would be kind of a common thing that exists in most, if not all. So I'll start with a basic convention, right, of a character type. A character type that's very common in horror films would be, sorry, I'm having issues with my stylus, some sort of killer, right? Right? So some form of killer is going to be incredibly common in a lot of horror films. Most horror films have someone who is killing or someone who is threatening in some way. They have something kind of scary happening going on, right? So if you have killers, you're also likely to have victims. You might have a final girl, right? The girl that survives until the end of the film. You might have a setting like kind of a creepy cabin somewhere, or like a haunted castle, or a graveyard. In the plot, you're likely to have some kind of like tension or fear, right? You're going to have all of these different conventions, things that are kind of standard. Now, does every single horror film have a killer with victims? Is there a cabin or a castle or a graveyard? Are all of those things kind of standard across the board? No, not necessarily. But if you see enough of these things, you might start to think, yes, this is a horror film, right? Unwritten rules or expectations about the setting, the characters, the actors, the plots, the narrative devices, right? So if we think about like actors who are common in horror films, right? If you look at older horror films, you might get like Vincent Price or Boris Karloff. Newer horror films, oh gosh, I guess I don't watch enough newer horror films to really know. Johnny Depp was in a lot of horror films in his early career. Like, for example, is every film he's in a horror film? No. But is he in a lot of horror films? Yes, right? So you might be able to look at a particular actor or actress, a particular type of character, a place, a storyline, a plot, and say like, this is a convention of horror, right? Now, iconography remembers specifically visual elements, so things that you can see, right? And some of these obviously would kind of fall into both categories, right? Like a cabin is something that you can see as well, but iconography is strictly visual. So you might get something like a machete, for example, right? Or a chainsaw, or blood, right? Lots of horror movies have blood. Not all of them are bloody. Um, you might get something like cobwebs or tombstones, black cats, lots of fire. Lots of fire in horror movies, right? Like Frankenstein, Carrie, people setting things on fire, people being set on fire, right? This is just a brief list of different pieces of iconography. Now, these are visual indicators, right, of what a horror film might look like. And if you get into particular types of horror films, subgenres or franchises, they become even more specific, right? So the machete, I always associate that with the Friday the 13th films, the machete and the mask, right? The Jason mask. Chainsaw, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? There are going to be kind of specific pieces of iconography where you can even trace them to particular films, right? So the iconography are sort of visual indicators that the type of film that you're watching might be a horror film. If you see blood in a film, is it necessarily a horror film? No. Blood makes an appearance in lots of different types of films. Action films, science fiction films, sometimes even a romantic comedy. Someone gets a bloody nose or something like that, right? So blood alone is not an indicator that you're watching a horror film. Even blood plus machete does not necessarily mean that it's a horror film. It could be something different, right? But if you get enough of these things together, right? A bloody machete and a cobweb over a tombstone, and then they're in a graveyard and there's a final girl, maybe you're starting to look at a horror film, or a film that could be categorized as a horror film. Conventions in iconography build upon one another, right? They build up together. So it's not just finding one visual indicator or one convention, it's finding lots of different things that indicate there is a family resemblance between this film and other films of this particular type. Just like your family resemblance between you and maybe your cousin, or maybe your mother, or maybe your sibling isn't just, oh, well, we have the same bone structure. Like, well, everyone in my family is really tall, or everyone in my family has brown hair, right? Usually there are multiple indicators of family relationships. That's how family relationships work in genre films as well, is that usually there are lots of different little ways that you can tell this film is a particular type of film. Now, I would encourage you to think about a genre of film that you're familiar with. Maybe you watch a lot of romantic comedies, maybe you watch a lot of true crime, whatever it happens to be, and to draw one of these little charts out, conventions and iconography, and write a list of what do you see, iconography, in that type of film. What's common in that type of film as far as like plot, storyline, characters, actors. And then the next time you watch that type of film, see how many of those things you notice, right? So if I was going to watch a horror film, or even like an episode of a horror TV show, right? What We Do in the Shadows season 2 just came out, for example, right? If I watch the first episode of season 2 of What We Do in the Shadows, I bet that I will be able to find some things that fit into my idea of what a horror convention looks like and what horror iconography looks like. So that's my suggestion to you, is to make one of these little charts. The next time you watch a genre film where you can say, oh, this is a melodrama, this is a romantic comedy, right? This is a period piece, this is a documentary. I want you to write down a list of what you see, what you hear, what you think, and kind of compare notes about whether or not the conventions in iconography match what you expected. Now, usually what you'll find is that your expectations as an audience member are pretty on the money. Whether or not you spent a lot of time thinking about what does a horror movie look like, once you ask yourself that question, you'll realize that you actually kind of knew it all along. So genre is one of those things that we already know pretty well. I just want you to take the time to sit and think about it a little bit more, to write it down, and the next time you watch a genre film, to see how close you were. All right, so that's all on genre for right now. I'm gonna come back shortly with some videos on genre experimentation. So what happens when we take these rules and we start to break them? All right, so thanks for sticking around. I'll see you in the next video.